On a Tuesday morning in September of 1978, a man named Gerald Tanner drove his county extension truck down the gravel lane of the Hensley farm and stepped out into the pale Ohio light with the unhurried confidence of someone who already knew how the conversation was going to end. He was 59 years old. He had been the Wayne County Agricultural Extension Agent for 21 years. He had watched farms survive and farms fail, and he believed with the particular certainty of a man who has been right about most things for most of his career, that he could tell the difference between the two. Within about 30 seconds of arriving, he stood at the fence line with his cap in his hand and 3 neighboring farmers standing behind him who had driven over. Because word had gotten around. Word always got around in Wayne County. 6 animals stood in the upper pasture, slate gray, broad-shouldered, heavy through the neck and chest, moving with the unhurried patience of something that had existed for 14,000 years and had no particular interest in explaining itself to central Ohio. They were water buffalo, Mediterranean stock imported from a Vermont breeder who had been trying to sell them for 3 years to anyone who would listen. They did not belong here. Everyone present understood that. The question was how to say it politely to a 47-year-old widow who had driven 920 miles in 2 days to buy them with what anyone could reasonably assume was every dollar she had saved since her husband Robert died. Gerald Tanner looked at the buffalo. He looked at Clara Hensley, who was standing at the pasture gate with a leather tally book in her left hand and no particular expression on her face. He put his cap back on. He told her that the Ohio Department of Agriculture had no inspection protocol for water buffalo milk. He told her that the Worcester milk hauler ran only Holstein tankers and would not retool for a 40-acre specialty operation. He told her that the closest Italian restaurant market was 86 miles away in Cleveland, and that Cleveland had no established buyer base for water buffalo cheese. He told her that by spring of 1980, she would be trying to sell these animals at salvage price to a zoo in Columbus or a traveling fair, and that when that day came, he wanted her to know that he had said this on a Tuesday morning in September, before witnesses, and that the offer to consolidate her acreage with Bert Calloway's operation to the north was still open and would remain open for another 60 days. He said all of this in a measured professional voice, not cruel, not malicious, just a man who believed he was doing someone a favor by being honest before she made things worse. Clara Hensley listened to all 6 points without blinking. Then she closed her tally book, looked at Gerald Tanner for a moment with dark, patient eyes, and said that she appreciated him driving out. Then she turned and walked back toward the barn. Gerald put his cap back on, nodded to the 3 neighbors, and drove home. That was the beginning of the story. But to understand the story, you have to go back 9 months earlier to a December evening in 1977, to a room in the Worcester Mennonite Care Home on the south side of town, where an old woman who no longer knew what year it was looked at her daughter and asked a question that changed everything. Barbara Hensley was 78 years old. She had Alzheimer's disease, which in those years was not always named, plainly often called hardening of the arteries or confusion of the mind or simply the forgetting. Most days she did not know what month it was. Most days she called Clara by the name of a cousin who had died in 1952. Most days she asked whether supper was ready when it was 7 in the morning and whether the cows had been brought in when there had been no cows on the property for 15 years. But on the evening of December the 4th, something shifted. Clara came in from the cold and sat in the chair beside her mother's bed, and Barbara looked up from her hands with eyes that were clear, completely clear, the way they had been before the forgetting came in, like weather off the lake, slow at first, and then total. Barbara reached out and took Clara's hand. Her voice was steady, no waver in it. She asked whether Clara had opened the box. Clara's breath caught. She asked which box. "The chestnut box," Barbara said. "The one your grandmother gave me. The one I gave you when I moved here in '71. Did you open it?" Clara had not opened it. It sat in the cedar chest at the foot of her bed. Had sat there for 7 years since the afternoon the care home attendants helped Barbara pack the last of her house, and Clara had carried the box up to her own room and set it inside the cedar chest, and not looked at it since. Not because she had forgotten it, because she was not ready. Because some things ask you to wait until you are strong enough to receive them. And Clara had spent 7 years wondering if she was strong enough yet. Barbara's hand tightened. Her voice came out almost urgent. "Open it," she said. "Your grandmother is asking when you are going to open it." The moment held. Then Barbara's eyes went soft and the clarity drained away the way it always did, like water finding its level. And she looked at Clara with the gentle, empty expression of someone who had just arrived somewhere unfamiliar and was trying to be polite about it. Clara drove home through the snow. She pulled into the gravel yard of the farm. She went upstairs, opened the cedar chest, lifted the chestnut box out with both hands, carried it down to the kitchen, made coffee, sat at the oak table that had belonged to Robert's grandfather, and untied the hemp twine that still bound the box, the way it had been bound when Rosa DeLuca crossed the Atlantic in 1898. Inside, she found 7 wooden molds, hand-carved from a single block of Italian alder, each one rubbed smooth from decades of use, small and simple and beautiful, in the way old tools are beautiful when they were made by hands that understood exactly what they were for. She found 3 packets of starter culture wrapped in beeswax paper. The handwriting on the labels dated 1897. The ink still dark. She found a recipe book. The Italian was old, some of it in dialect so regional that Clara had to sound out words the way a child learns to read. But the last page was in English, in her grandmother's handwriting, dated April of 1961, the year before Rosa died. To my granddaughter, Clara Rosa had written, "If you are reading these words, I am gone. The box is yours. The recipes are yours. The promise is yours. America will not be ready for our cheese in my lifetime. America will be ready in yours. You will know when. You will not need anyone to tell you. Buy the buffalo. Make the cheese. Trust your hands. Your grandmother, Rosa DeLuca." Clara read it 4 times. She did not sleep that night, but it was what she found beneath the recipe book that she was not prepared for. A small envelope sealed, her name on the front in Rosa's hand. Inside, folded around a thin stack of bills, a note written on plain paper, $400 in cash. Bills of various denominations, some of them old enough that Clara had not seen that printing in years. Rosa had been saving them bill by bill through the 50s and 60s and into the 70s, setting them aside the way a woman sets aside what she believes in quietly and without announcement, against the day when someone would be ready. The note said only this: "To buy the first one. I knew you would need a start. I knew you would not ask. Go." Clara sat at the oak table with $400 in her hands and her grandmother's recipe book open in front of her and the 7 wooden molds lined up along the edge of the table. And she understood that Rosa had not simply left her a dream. Rosa had left her a plan. A plan 40 years in the making, funded from a cookie jar, or a coat pocket, or wherever an old Italian woman in Wayne County, Ohio, kept the money she was serious about. She went to the library in Worcester the next morning and asked for back issues of Hoard's Dairyman. The librarian brought 3 months. Clara read every page of the May issue. On page 47, a 3-paragraph article about specialty dairy breeds mentioned a man in Vermont named William Pratt, who had imported Mediterranean Italian water buffalo in 1973 and was looking for buyers. That evening, Clara wrote him a letter. She did not mention Rosa. She did not mention the recipe book or the $400 or the promise. She kept it short. She asked whether he had breeding stock available, what the price was, whether he would consider speaking with a serious buyer. She mailed it the next morning without telling Nathan. Nathan was 22 years old. He worked at the savings bank in town and wore a tie, and had recently begun talking with Edmund Grayson, the bank manager, about a possible path toward assistant manager in a few years. He was a good son. He came to the farm on weekends and helped with the Holstein milking, and did not ask his mother questions she had not invited yet. He had learned that from Robert, had learned that the way you asked a question shaped the answer, and that some answers needed to arrive on their own. 3 weeks after Clara mailed her letter, the Vermont reply came. William Pratt had breeding stock available. 6 animals would run $4,800, cash preferred. He could discuss transport if she was serious. Clara read it standing at the end of the gravel lane where she had picked up the mail. She read it twice. Then she walked back to the kitchen and put it in the drawer beside the stove, where she kept things she was not ready to discuss yet. She began preparing in May. On Saturday afternoons when Nathan was in town, she worked in the milking parlor with a handsaw and a tape measure, and lengths of white oak Robert had milled from the woodlot in 1968 and stored under the equipment shed. She was widening the stalls, adding clearance for broader shoulders, adjusting the tie rails, building accommodation for animals that did not yet exist on the property. Nathan came in one Saturday morning and found her measuring an upright. He looked at the oak plank. He looked at her. He did not ask. That was the thing about Nathan. He had learned when to push and when to wait. He poured coffee from the thermos she had brought out. He leaned against the doorframe. He said the bank had mentioned a possible promotion. Clara said that was good. He said Edmund Grayson thought assistant manager in 2 years, maybe manager in 5 if he stayed. Clara asked whether he wanted to stay, not as a leading question, as a real one. He was quiet a long moment. Then he said he did not know yet. She finished the cut set. The saw-down looked at him and said he had time to figure it out. He asked whether she did too. Now it was a question that meant something, because Nathan was not asking about her schedule. He was asking about the farm, about whether there was something happening that he did not know about yet, about whether his mother was running 40 acres of Holstein dairy for the rest of her natural life, or whether she was building towards something she had not told him. Clara picked up the oak upright, carried it to the first stall, fitted it into place. She told him he had time. Nathan did not push. He finished his coffee and went to feed the Holsteins. By June, she had reached Jacob Schlabach, the Mennonite carpenter who had built half the barns in the county. He came to her door on a Monday morning, drove his pickup right up to the kitchen, knocked. He was 67 years old. He had a reputation for not talking much and for doing the work right the first time, and for not charging what he should when the situation called for something other than business. Clara opened the door. He told her he had heard she might need some work done. She had not told anyone she needed work done, which meant word had reached him through channels she did not fully understand, which meant she needed to decide right now whether to explain herself or simply to commit. She committed. Basement cheese room, she said. Concrete floor with a center drain. Insulated walls. I need it finished before September. Jacob nodded. He did not ask what kind of cheese. He did not ask why. He simply asked his rate. She said she intended to pay the standard rate for the work. He was quiet a moment. Then he said there was no rate for this job. He was not charging her. She said she could pay. He said he knew she could. He said his father had bought a pound of her grandmother's cheese in 1924 and made his mother a sandwich with it and talked about that sandwich for the rest of his life. He said his father had died in 1963 and that he had been waiting without knowing he was waiting for the chance to do something about a sandwich that happened before he was born. "Let me build your cheese room," he said. "I am not taking money for it." Clara's throat went tight. She nodded. Jacob started Monday. By the end of July, she had a proper cheese room in the basement. Poured concrete floor, white insulated walls, 2 stainless steel vats she had found at a Cleveland estate auction in June for $90 apiece. 4 wooden stretching tables Jacob had built to the measurements she gave him. A small aging room insulated with packed barn straw. Nathan had welded a hand-cranked curd cutter from an old Alice Chalmers flywheel on a Sunday afternoon without asking why, because by then he had stopped asking why about the changes his mother was making and had started simply helping, which was its own kind of answer. On the wall above the stretching tables, Clara hung a glass case. Inside the case, 7 wooden molds from the chestnut box. She would not use them for production. Food safety regulations made that impossible, and she did not dispute the regulations. But she needed to see them every time she looked up from the work. She needed Rosa in the room. In the 3rd week of August, Clara borrowed a stock truck from a neighbor and told Nathan she was going to look at some equipment and drove 460 miles north to Vermont. She arrived in Bristol at 4 in the afternoon. William Pratt met her in his gravel yard. He was 61 years old and lean and had the look of a man who had bet everything on something nobody else believed in and was starting to calculate whether he had been right. They walked to the pasture without speaking. 28 head of Mediterranean Italian water buffalo stood in the late afternoon light. Slate gray, most of them, some so dark they were almost blue at the edge of the coat. They moved slowly. They watched her with patient brown eyes, the kind of eyes that have no particular agenda and no memory of hurry. Clara walked among them for an hour. She put her hands on their shoulders, felt the bone structure through the thick coats. She checked udders. She watched how the animals stood together. Which ones led, which ones followed. Which ones held the herd in its shape. William Pratt walked at a distance and let her work. By the time the sun was down, she had chosen 6 animals. 3 bred heifers due to freshen in March and April. 2 dry cows, full sisters, steady and calm, and the kind of animals you built a herd around. And 1 young bull 18 months old, broad through the shoulder and deep in the chest. His coat so dark it held the last of the evening light like something had been poured into him. William Pratt had called him Anchor. Clara kept the name. They went back to this kitchen. She opened her purse, counted $4,800 onto the table. William counted it again. Then he looked up. He told her he wanted to say something. He said he had been trying to move surplus stock for 3 years and had not had a single serious inquiry in 18 months. He said her letter had been the first real offer he had received. He said he would have sold to almost anyone by now. But he wanted her to know she was the right person. He could see it. Clara's chest went tight. She said her grandmother had believed the day would come. William Pratt nodded slowly. He said it looked like her grandmother had been right. Loading took most of the next morning. Clara drove home through the night. Stopped once for fuel outside Akron. Once for coffee in the dark before the Pennsylvania line. She pulled into the gravel yard of the Hensley farm at 5:30 in the morning on the 5th of September, 1978. The grass was wet with cold dew. The first light was coming up pale over the back pasture. The kitchen door opened before she had shut the engine off. Nathan came out in his work coat, hair uncombed, coffee in one hand. He had heard the truck. He stood on the porch and looked at the trailer, and then at his mother, and then back at the trailer with an expression that said he had just understood that she had been lying to him for 4 months, not out of deception, but out of the particular privacy of someone who needed to finish building the thing before she could explain it. Clara dropped the pin at the back of the trailer and swung the ramp down. The first buffalo descended slowly, placing each hoof with the gravity of an animal that had nowhere it needed to be. Then the second, then the third. Nathan set his coffee down on the porch railing. He walked across the gravel and stopped 10 feet from the ramp and stood in silence for a full minute. When he spoke, his voice was quiet and steady. He asked what they were. Clara latched the ramp and turned to face him. She said these were what his great-great-grandmother had carried across the Atlantic in her mind in 1898. She said they were going to make her cheese. Nathan looked at the buffalo. He looked at Clara. He looked at the buffalo again. He asked whether anyone in the county knew. "Not yet," Clara said. "They will by Sunday." He thought about that. Then he picked up his coffee from the porch. Railing took a long drink, set it back down, and started to laugh. Not mockery, not disbelief. Just the sound of a man realizing his mother had been planning something for months, and he had missed every single sign. And he found that genuinely deeply funny. He pointed out that she had been modifying the stall since May. She confirmed it. He noted the cheese room Paul Miller finishing it in July. She confirmed that too. He mentioned the trip to Cleveland for equipment. She said 2 stainless vats and a hand crank, $90 each. He shook his head slowly. He said she was either the smartest woman in Wayne County or the craziest. She said they would find out. She climbed back into the truck and pulled out before he could ask anything else. He stood in the gravel yard in the early morning light and watched her go. By the time she brought the second load home that evening, 6 water buffalo were already grazing in the upper pasture, as though they had been there for years. And Donald Moore's brother-in-law had driven past. On Route 83, glanced through the fence, hit his brakes, and sat on the gravel shoulder for 30 seconds, staring at animals that had no business being in Wayne County, Ohio. Then he turned around and drove to Worcester. By 2 in the afternoon, the news had reached the diner on Liberty Street. By 4, it had reached the extension office. By 6, it had reached Gerald Tanner. Gerald was 59 years old. He had been telling Wayne County farmers what to do for 21 years. His brother-in-law, Bert Calloway, owned the biggest commercial Holstein operation in the county, 400 acres, 300 head. Gerald had been approaching the subject of Clara's 40 acres for 4 years since Robert died carefully, and sideways bringing casseroles his wife Helen made, asking whether leasing the back 20 made sense, suggesting that consolidation would let Clara live comfortably in Worcester and let Nathan have a real career instead of whatever this was going to be. Clara had thanked him every time and done none of it. And now she had 6 water buffalo. Gerald sat at his kitchen table at 6:15 with his cap in his lap. Helen was stirring beef stew at the stove. She did not turn around. She told him to say it. He said Clara had lost her mind. Helen set the spoon down. She turned off the burner. She turned around and looked at her husband. She told him that he was not to say that. Not about Clara. Not after what Clara had been through. She told him he was going to drive over there in the morning, and he was going to ask Clara what she had done, and he was going to stand there and listen to the answer without once opening his mouth to tell her she was wrong. Gerald sat with his cap for a long moment. Then he said he knew. Helen told him to go. He went the next morning, Tuesday, 7:30, extension truck. He found Clara at the south gate of the upper pasture, with her tally book just finishing an entry, not turning around. until she was done. She closed the book and walked across the wet grass to meet him. She did not open the gate. He took off his cap. He held it in both hands. He told her he had driven past, counted 6 animals, come home, asked Helen to set him straight. He looked past her at the buffalo. He looked back at her. He used her first name. She told him she would like to keep this brief, and that she did not want coffee. He asked as plainly as he could manage what in God's name she had done. She crossed her arms. She told him the facts. 6 Italian Mediterranean water buffalo, purchased from a Vermont breeder named William Pratt. 3 bred heifers, 2 dry cows, 1 young bull. $4,800 cash paid in full. 920 miles hauled in 2 trips. The heifers would freshen in March. She was going to milk them by hand and make fresh Italian mozzarella from her grandmother's recipe. She was going to sell direct to Italian-American specialty buyers in Cleveland and Pittsburgh without involving the regional milk co-op. She was running it as a separate operation on the same 40 acres, and she was not asking anyone's permission. Gerald heard all of it. He took his cap off and put it back on. He ran through 6 objections, each one reasonable, each one the kind of thing a man says when he genuinely believes he is saving someone from themselves. Clara listened without blinking. When he finished, she told him she was not asking him to understand. She was telling him so he would not have to ask again. Gerald looked at the 6 animals for a long time. Then he said he could not stop her. She said she knew that. He said he could not help her either. She said she was not asking him to. He drove home. He sat at his kitchen table for 2 hours. Helen came in from the garden and washed her hands and poured him cold coffee and sat down across from him. He said Clara had thought about it longer than he had. Helen said that bothered him. He said she was 47 years old and a widow, and she was running 40 acres alone. And she had just told him she was going to be the only commercial buffalo dairy east of the Rocky Mountains in 8 years. Helen said she did not know what he was supposed to do with that. He said he did not know either. Helen looked at him across the table. She told him to go to work. She told him to leave Clara alone. And then she told him something she had never told him before, which was that she had tasted Rosa DeLuca's cheese in the summer of 1938, when she was 9 years old, and that there had been nothing in that county like it, and that she had never forgotten it. Gerald looked up. He said she had never told him that. She said he had never asked. She went back to the garden. Gerald sat at the table until 2 in the afternoon, and somewhere behind what he was thinking, behind the extension agent's logic, and the 21 years of experience and the certainty that had served him well for most of his career, something small and quiet was beginning to shift. He did not have a name for it yet. He would not have a name for it for almost 2 years. But it was there. By the second week of October, every farmer in Wayne County had heard. The Worcester Diner on Liberty Street filled Tuesday and Friday mornings with men in faded ball caps arguing about the federal milk price and the fall silage and whether the dairy buyout was coming. Clara Hensley's water buffalo became the central topic by the second week. Gerald had told the story at the counter 4 mornings running, told it at the dairy producers meeting, told it at the Methodist coffee hour on the 3rd Sunday. The mockery was not cruel. It was small-town disbelief dressed up in the clothing of concern. At the feed mill, a woman said in a voice meant to be heard that the Hensley widow had let grief get the better of her judgment. At the savings bank, the manager, Edmund Grayson, pulled Clara aside after a routine deposit and asked in a careful voice whether she had considered how the milk hauler was going to respond when she tried to ship water buffalo milk to a Holstein processor. At the Methodist potluck on the 3rd Sunday of October, the pastor's wife took Clara's elbow in the fellowship hall and asked in a gentle voice whether the buffalo were something Robert would have approved of. Clara looked at her across the folding table. She said Robert would have asked what Rosa thought. The pastor's wife did not say anything. Clara washed her dish herself and drove home. That same week, Helen Tanner drove to Worcester alone and told Gerald she was going to the fabric store, and did not go to the fabric store. She drove to the Hensley farm, parked on the shoulder, walked up the lane, did not knock at the kitchen door, walked straight to the barn. She found Clara in the milking parlor, scrubbing the inflation rubbers on the surge milkers. She said she wanted to apologize for her husband. Clara said Gerald was doing what he was paid to do. She said Helen did not owe her anything. Helen's voice went quiet. She told Clara she had tasted Rosa's cheese in the summer of 1938. She said she was 9 years old, and she had not forgotten it. She said she wanted to be the first person in the county to buy a pound when the heifers freshened. She wanted to pay full price. She did not want to tell Gerald. She asked whether Clara could do that for her. Clara set down the scrub brush. She said she could do that. She said the first wheel she sold in Wayne County would be Helen's. Helen nodded. She turned around and walked back to her car and drove home and did not tell Gerald, and would not tell Gerald for 9 years. And Clara stood in the milking parlor and understood for the first time that she was not entirely alone, that somewhere in the count, hidden and quiet, there were people who remembered, people who had been waiting, people who would not say it in the diner, or at the dairy meeting, or at the Methodist potluck, but who were watching and who wanted her to succeed. She went back to scrubbing the inflation rubbers, because the first heifers were going to freshen in March, and she had 4 months to get ready. By the middle of November, Nathan had stopped asking about the promotion. He had stopped mentioning Edmund Grayson. He came to the farm every evening after the bank closed and changed into work clothes and went straight to the back pasture to check on the herd. He had named the bull anchor because William Pratt had already called him that, and it fit. He had named the lead dry cow after his grandmother's name. He had named the 3 bred heifers after the great aunts Rosa had written about in the margins of the recipe book. Clara watched him do this without commenting, because you do not name animals you are planning to leave behind. And she knew without either of them saying it that her son had already made his decision. He was just waiting for the right moment to say it out loud. Edmund Grayson called Nathan into his office in early December. He closed the door. He leaned back in his chair and folded his hands on the desk and said simply, "The buffalo." Not a question, a statement. Nathan confirmed his mother was serious. Grayson asked how serious. Nathan described the modified stalls, the cheese room Jacob Schlabach built in July, the vats from Cleveland, the curd cutter Nathan had welded himself from a flywheel on a Sunday afternoon. Grayson was quiet. Then he asked whether Nathan was staying, and there it was. The question Nathan had been turning over since September, since the morning his mother pulled into the gravel yard at 5:30, with a truck full of animals nobody wanted, since he had stood in the early light and looked at the buffalo grazing and laughed. Not at his mother, but at himself. At the fact that he had been standing in this story the whole time, without recognizing it. He said he was going to give Grayson his notice. He said he would stay through January to help with the transition. He said he was sorry to leave and grateful for the years. Grayson looked at him for a moment. Then he said he was not surprised. He said Nathan's mother had built something that did not exist anywhere else in the state, and it was going to need someone who understood both the land and the ledger. He stood up and shook Nathan's hand. Nathan drove home, found Clara in the milking parlor doing a final check on the modified stalls, making sure the measurements were right. making sure everything was ready for March. She looked up. He told her he had given his notice. She set down the tape measure. She straightened. She looked at her son in the low light of the milking parlor. This 22-year-old man who had his father's hands and his great-great-grandmother's patience, and she felt something settle in her chest that she had not known was unsettled. He told her he had been sure since October. He said he had just been afraid to say it. She said his father would have been proud. He said, yeah, he would have. They stood in the milking parlor that Robert had built in 1961, in the barn that Robert's grandfather had framed in 1923, on 40 acres that had held 3 generations of the same family's faith and labor and quiet determination. And outside in the cold November dark, 6 water buffalo stood in the upper pasture and breathed slow columns of steam into the Ohio air patient, as the ground itself waiting for March. Clara drove to Cleveland on a Friday in late November, 86 miles north through country that looked exactly like Wayne County, but with different silos and different names on the mailboxes. She hit the city at 3 in the afternoon and found the Murray Hill neighborhood and parked on Mayfield Road and walked half a block to the steps of a basement restaurant with a hand-painted sign. The steps went down. The room was empty in the mid-afternoon pause. A man in a white apron was wiping glasses behind the bar. He was 63 years old. He had the face of someone who had survived everything the 20th century had thought to throw at his particular piece of the world, and was not especially impressed by most of it. His name was Vincent Caruso. He was Sicilian. He had come to Cleveland in 1947 and opened the restaurant in 1954 and had been making the same food for 24 years because the food was right, and he saw no reason to change what was right. He looked at Clara and said politely that they opened at 5. She set the package on the bar. She told him she was not there to eat. She was there to sell him cheese. He set down the glass. She told him it was fresh mozzarella made from Mediterranean water buffalo milk on her farm in Wayne County. Her grandmother's recipe, Lombardy, 1898. She had been milking 3 buffalo by hand for 2 months. She had driven 86 miles that afternoon to ask him to taste it. If he did not like it, she would drive home and not come back. If he liked it, they could talk. Vincent Caruso looked at her for a long moment. Not hostile, not warm, just the careful attention of a man who had heard every pitch and met every person who thought they had something special and had learned that most of them were wrong. He came around the bar. He took the package to the kitchen. Clara waited at the bar for 4 minutes. When he came back, he was not carrying the package. He was carrying a small folding knife with a flake of fresh white cheese on the blade. He looked at her across the bar. His eyes were wet. He set the knife down on the bar top. He poured her a glass of red wine she had not asked for. He told her to sit down. She sat. He told her he had tasted his grandmother's cheese in Palermo in the summer of 1926. He said he was 8 years old, and his father had taken him to her farmhouse, and she had made it for them fresh that morning. He said he had not tasted that cheese since. He said he had eaten what they called mozzarella in Cleveland and Pittsburgh and Chicago, and what the Italian importers shipped from New York at prices that should have guaranteed quality but did not. He said he had not tasted his grandmother's cheese in 52 years. He picked up the knife again. He looked at the white flake on the blade. He said, until today. He set the knife down. He looked at Clara Hensley, 47 years old, barn coat, Wrangler jeans, muck boots that had seen 1,000 mornings like this one. He said he would buy every will she could make. He said he would pay $7 a pound cash every Friday. He said he wanted 12 pounds the first week, 15 the second, and 20 by the end of May. Clara told him she could do 12. She told him 20 by the end of May was beyond the herd. By the end of summer, she could do 20. He said by the end of summer then, every week whatever she could bring. Cash. No contract. A handshake. He held out his hand. She shook it. She drove home that evening with $84 in tens and ones in an envelope on the passenger seat, the first commercial payment for water buffalo mozzarella in the state of Ohio. Not a check. Cash from a Sicilian restaurateur's apron pocket settled with a handshake in a basement on Mayfield Road, 86 miles from a farm where 6 animals were grazing in the November dark, and the first heifers were going to freshen in March. She laid the envelope on the kitchen table when she got home. Nathan looked at it. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said she had done it. She said they had done it. He poured himself a glass of milk from the refrigerator and sat down across from her. And they talked about March, about what the milking would look like with 3 animals in production, about the cheese room and the culture, and the temperature and the stretch, about all the things that needed to happen between now and the first wheel. Outside, the cold came down from Canada, the way it did every November, slow and deliberate, and the buffalo stood in it without concern, their thick coats holding the heat of their bodies against the Ohio winter patient, and ancient and exactly where they were supposed to be. In Wayne County, in the diners and the feed mills and the church fellowship halls, people were still laughing. They would be laughing in December and into the new year. They would be laughing when the heifers freshened in March, and Clara began milking by hand before dawn. But in a basement restaurant on Mayfield Road in Cleveland, a 63-year-old man from Palermo was telling the story of a sandwich his grandmother had made in 1926 to every customer who sat at his bar. And in a cheese room in the basement of a 40-acre farm in Wayne County, 7 wooden molds sat in a glass case on the wall above the stretching tables carved in 1879, rubbed smooth by 100 years of hands that knew what they were for. And in the upper pasture, 6 water buffalo breathed slow and steady in the cold Ohio night and waited. The first heifer freshened on the 7th of March, 1979. Clara found her in the back corner of the upper pasture at 5:30 in the morning. A wet, slate-gray calf already standing and nursing in the cold air, which meant the milk was coming in, which meant it was time. She brought the heifer into the modified stall and attached the cluster Nathan had adapted from the spare Surge milker frame the previous August. The larger diameter rubbers he had ordered from a Lancaster, Pennsylvania supplier, who handled specialty livestock equipment for Amish operations. The heifer stood quiet and patient, in a way the Holsteins never had. She let the machine do its work without protest, without the sideways shifting and tail swatting that Clara had managed for 20 years with the black and whites. She simply stood and chewed and let the milk come down, and it came down thick, pale, cream-colored, richer than anything the parlor had ever seen. Clara caught the first draw in a stainless steel bucket and held it up to the light from the single bulb overhead. 9% butterfat, maybe more. Triple the cream of the best Holstein she had ever milked. The second heifer freshened 2 weeks later, the third in the first week of April. By the middle of April, Clara had 3 buffalo and milk, was milking twice daily at dawn, and dusk was filling 2 5-gallon stainless buckets every 24 hours, and was ready to make the first wheel. Nathan took a day off from the bank to be there, though he was already working his last weeks, already in the process of handing off his accounts to the man Edmund Grayson had hired to replace him. He stood in the cheese room doorway while Clara worked the curd at the stretching table, his hands at his sides, not speaking, because this was not a moment for speaking. This was a moment for watching. The stretch was the part that required everything Rosa had passed down through 4 generations of women who had learned it in stone farmhouses before anyone thought to write it down. Clara heated water to 170 degrees in the second vat, scooped the broken curd, submerged it, waited for it to soften into something that moved the way warm bread dough moves, the way something alive moves when it decides to cooperate. Then she reached in with both hands. The water was hot, close to the edge of what hands could bear. She grabbed the mass of curd and pulled it, stretched it, the way taffy is stretched, folded it back on itself, pulled again, folded again, the motion rhythmic and sure. 5 minutes of work that contained inside it. Every morning Rosa had done this in Italy, and every lesson Rosa had given to the daughter she raised in Ohio. Nathan watched without breathing for a long time. When Clara shaped the first ball and set it in the mold, she carried the plate upstairs to the oak table and set it down and looked at her son. Neither of them spoke. Nathan reached out and took a piece between his thumb and forefinger. He put it in his mouth. He chewed once. He stopped. He set his hands flat on the table. His eyes filled. When he could speak, his voice came out unsteady, as though something had broken loose in his chest that had been held in place for a long time. He asked where this had been his entire life. Clara's own eyes went wet. Not from the cheese, though the cheese was as close to perfect as anything she had ever made. From watching her son understand what Rosa had carried across an ocean. From watching the promise arrive in a kitchen in Ohio, the way it had been meant to arrive quietly and without announcement, in the hands of the right generation at the right time. She told him it had been waiting in the recipe book since 1898. He sat with that. Then he told her the bank was wrong about them. He said Gerald Tanner was wrong and Edmund Grayson was wrong and every man at the counter in the Worcester diner was wrong. She said they were not wrong yet. Not until they sold a pound. He said they were wrong starting next week. She wrapped half the wheel in waxed paper and tied it with hemp twine and drove 4 miles to the Tanner farm the next morning. Gerald was at the extension office. Helen was in the kitchen. Clara knocked and Helen opened the door and saw the bundle and took it with both hands, the way you take something fragile, something that has traveled a long distance to reach you. Helen asked how much. Clara said $2.50. Helen went to the kitchen jar where she kept the household money, counted out 2 bills and 2 quarters, pressed them into Clara's hand. She said she was going to eat this with Gerald on a Sunday when he was too distracted to ask where it came from. Clara told her he was going to know eventually. Helen said eventually was not today. She closed the door. Clara drove home knowing she had sold the first pound, which meant the second was possible. And the second was harder because the second was a stranger. By the end of 1979, Clara was producing 22 pounds of mozzarella per week, supplying Vincent Caruso in Cleveland, and 3 other Italian restaurants she had found through word of mouth, and 2 drives into the city with samples in brown paper bags. Annual gross on the Buffalo line was just under $6,000. On the back of 3 milking animals on 40 acres, that was 11% of total farm revenue. She wrote that number in her tally book and underlined it twice, because 11% on 3 animals was a direction, and a direction given enough time becomes a destination. The winter of 1979 into 1980 was cold in the way Ohio winters are cold, deep and gray and settled, the kind of cold that does not apologize for itself. The buffalo handled it without difficulty. Their thick coats held against temperatures that sent the Holsteins crowding together against the far wall of the barn. They stood in the snow and chewed their cud with the unhurried calm of animals that had been bred for harder climates than this. and found Ohio winters relatively mild by comparison. Clara was beginning to understand that she had chosen the right animal for reasons she had not fully known when she chose them. Then came the night in the second week of March 1980 that she had not prepared for. She woke at 2:45 in the morning to a sound she could not immediately identify. Not a sound so much as an absence of sound. A break in the rhythm of the farm at night. The particular silence that means something is wrong. She was dressed and out the door in 4 minutes. She found the lead dry cow she had named after her grandmother in the far corner of the upper pasture, lying on her side, her breathing shallow and labored, her sides distended with the tight, drum-like pressure of severe bloat. Clara had left the alfalfa gate unlatched the previous evening. Her first major mistake in 18 months of running the herd. The cow had grazed on fresh alfalfa for hours without supervision, and the gas had built up in her rumen until it was compressing her organs from the inside. Clara knelt in the mud and put her hands on the animal's side and felt the tightness of it, and understood what she was dealing with, and understood also that she was alone, that it was 2:45 in the morning, and that if she could not get a trocar into that rumen in the next 30 minutes, the cow would die. She ran back to the house. She found the emergency veterinary number posted beside the telephone. She dialed. No answer. She tried the secondary number. 14 rings and nothing. She stood in the kitchen with the telephone in her hand and looked at the clock on the wall. 2:51 in the morning. She had watched Robert use a trocar on a bloated Holstein once in 1968. She had been standing in the parlor doorway. She had not been paying close attention because it was Robert's thing, the veterinary decisions, the emergency procedures, the calls made at 3 in the morning when the situation required them. She had been the one who ran the books and managed the milk schedule and kept the records and baked the bread and raised Nathan and did the other 100 things that kept a farm family alive. She had not been the one with the trocar. She was now the one with the trocar. And the animal she needed to save was the foundation of the herd. She had spent $4,800 on every dollar of 3 years of savings, plus the $400 Rosa had left her. The animal whose milk and calves would determine whether the next 5 years worked or did not work. She stood in the kitchen with the telephone in her hand for what felt like a long time, but was probably less than a minute. Then, she dialed the number she had told herself she would never need to dial. Gerald Tanner answered on the 3rd ring. His voice was alert in the way that farm men's voices are always alert at 3 in the morning because 3 in the morning is never good news. And they have spent their lives knowing it. She told him her name and told him she had a severely bloated animal and could not reach the vet and needed someone who knew what they were doing. There was a brief silence. Then he said he would be there in 15 minutes. He was there in 12. He came through the pasture gate at a walk bag in hand, wearing his work coat over his pajamas. And he did not look surprised or judgmental, or anything other than focused. He knelt beside the animal, listened to her gut, pressed his palm against her side, assessed the situation with the practiced efficiency of a man who had been dealing with livestock emergencies for 30 years. He did the procedure. It was not clean work, and it was not quiet work, but it was competent work, and by 4:30 in the morning the animal was breathing normally, and her sides had eased and the crisis had passed. When he finished, Gerald packed his bag and stood up and looked at Clara across the animal's back. She told him what she owed him. He said there was no charge. He picked up his bag and walked back through the gate and got in his truck and drove home. He did not say anything about why she had called him instead of someone else. He did not make anything of the fact that she had called him at all the man who had stood at her fence in September of 1978 and listed 6 reasons she was going to fail. He simply came when she called and did what needed to be done and left. Clara stayed in the pasture until it was fully light. She sat in the wet grass beside the animal that was now breathing easy and chewing with the tranquil concentration of a ruminant that had no memory of the crisis it had just survived. She watched the gray light come up over the back field and the frost burn off the grass, and the rest of the herd begin to move toward the water trough. She had been close to something the night before, sitting in the mud in the dark, waiting for Gerald's headlights at the end of the lane. She had been close to the version of this story where she called it a mistake and sold the animals and went back to the Holstein dairy and told no one how close she had come to believing Rosa was wrong about the timing. She had not made that call. She had made the other one. She got up, brushed the mud off her jeans, and went back to the barn to start the morning milking. She did not call Gerald to thank him. She thought about it. She decided that what had happened in the pasture at 3 in the morning did not need to be made into anything more than what it was, which was 2 people who had known each other for years doing what the situation required. That understanding, unspoken, seemed to her more honest than anything words would have made of it. 11 months later, in January of 1981, an envelope arrived from the Ohio Department of Agriculture. Clara opened it at the kitchen table. It was a cease and desist notice. The department had been alerted to the existence of a commercial dairy operation in Wayne County producing milk from water buffalo, a species for which no inspection protocol existed under current Ohio dairy regulations. Clara had 30 days to cease production or bring her operation into compliance with applicable state standards. She read it twice. Then she set it on the table and poured herself coffee and thought about it for an hour. Nathan came in from the morning milking and read it standing at the counter. He set it down and looked at his mother. She told him she was going to find out who made the call. It took him 4 days. The answer came through a friend of a friend who worked in the county clerk's office and had no particular loyalty to the official channels of information in Wayne County. The complaint had originated with a member of the County Agricultural Advisory Board. That board member was the brother-in-law of Bert Calloway, whose 400-acre Holstein operation sat to the north of Clara's 40 acres, and who had been trying for 5 years through various means, first direct offers, and then through Gerald's approaches, and then a one-time legal consultation Clara had never heard about until this moment, to acquire the Hensley property. Bert Calloway had not filed the complaint himself. He had made a phone call to a brother-in-law who sat on a board that had a contact at the department in Columbus, and that contact had found a regulation that fit. And the letter had arrived in Clara's mailbox on a Tuesday morning with the official seal of the state of Ohio on the envelope. Clara looked at that information for a long time. She thought about calling a lawyer. She thought about what a lawyer would cost and what the outcome might be, and how long it might take and what would happen to the herd and the cheese room and the Brooklyn letter she had not yet answered in the interim. She decided not to call a lawyer. She decided to do something that no one who knew her would have found surprising, which was to sit down at the kitchen table with a legal pad and write the thing herself. She wrote the Ohio Water Buffalo Dairy Inspection Protocol. She wrote it over 6 weeks working at the kitchen table after dinner, working from the Holstein inspection standards she knew by heart, and the USDA dairy regulations she had obtained from the county agricultural office, and the veterinary literature on water buffalo dairy production she had requested from Ohio State University through the Worcester Public Library. She wrote it carefully and completely detailing milk testing procedures and cooling requirements and bacterial count thresholds and sanitation standards for the equipment and the cheese room. All of it grounded in the Holstein framework, because the principles were the same, even if the animal was different. She added sections on butterfat measurement protocols appropriate to the higher fat content of water. Buffalo milk sections on seasonal production. Variation sections on small herd inspection frequency that reflected the scale of her operation without compromising the standards that made the dairy inspections meaningful. She submitted it to the Ohio Department of Agriculture in April of 1981. She included a letter explaining that the absence of an inspection protocol was a gap in state regulation, not evidence that the operation was unregulatable, and that she had taken the liberty of drafting a framework for the department's consideration. The department sat on it for 3 months. Then they adopted it with minor modifications as the official Ohio standard for water buffalo dairy operations. It became the first such protocol in the United States. Clara never mentioned this at the diner, or at the Methodist potluck, or at any gathering where it might have been taken as a point scored in a contest she did not consider herself to be in. She wrote it in her tally book in her small, precise handwriting, and drew a line under it, and moved on. Nathan had formally quit the bank in late January and was working the farm full-time by February. He had said goodbye to Edmund Grayson on a Friday afternoon, and Grayson had shaken his hand and told him his mother had built something that would need someone who understood both the land and the books. Nathan had thanked him and meant it. He had driven home and gone straight to the barn and not looked back. Ruth Albrecht drove into the gravel yard on a Saturday morning in May of 1981 in a small pickup truck. She was 26 years old. Mennonite had grown up on a dairy farm 20 miles east. She wore a plain dress and her hair pulled back and had the look of someone who had been thinking about a thing for a long time and had finally decided to stop thinking and start doing. Clara met her at the barn door. Ruth said her name and her age, and said she had been reading about the Hensley operation for 2 years and wanted to learn to make the cheese. She said she could not pay. She could work free every Saturday drive the 40 miles round trip, do whatever was needed. Scrub vats, haul manure, milk by hand. She just needed someone to teach her what Clara knew. Clara looked at her for a moment. Then she told her to come inside, and she would pour coffee. Ruth came in. They sat at the oak table. Clara told her that she would teach her everything Rosa had taught through the recipe book, everything Clara had learned in 3 years of making the cheese by hand. She said she would not take $1 for it. She said there was one condition. Ruth waited. Clara said that when Ruth had her own operation, when the next woman drove to her gate asking to learn, Ruth would teach her the same way, free, with the same condition. That was the chain. That was how the knowledge stayed alive, not through money, through hands. Ruth said she would not break it. Her eyes were steady when she said it. She came every Saturday for the next 4 years, and she did not break it. By the end of 1982, the herd was 22 head. The cheese line was 24% of total farm revenue. By the end of 1983, 29 head and 31%. The Holstein herd on the same 40 acres was carrying the same milk price it had carried in 1978, which was not the same price it had been in 1975, and was certainly not the same as it had been in 1970. And the direction of that line was not in question. Every serious dairy farmer in Wayne County understood the mathematics of the federal milk pricing system by this point. They had lived inside those mathematics for the better part of a decade. The government set the price. The hauler set the schedule, and the farmer set his expenses as low as he could manage and hoped the gap between what the milk brought and what the operation cost stayed on the right side of zero. Bert Calloway had been running 400 acres and 300 head of Holstein for 20 years. He was a serious farmer. He was not a foolish man. He had made reasonable decisions about equipment and expansion at reasonable times, based on reasonable projections of where the federal milk price was going. He had borrowed money at reasonable interest rates by the standards of the mid-1970s, and then the interest rates had stopped being reasonable in 1979 and had not come back down, and the milk price had continued its quiet drift in the wrong direction. And by 1983, Bert was refinancing for the second time. He drove to Clara's gate in the fall of 1983, wore a dark suit that looked like it belonged at a funeral, walked through the gate without asking, which was the kind of thing Bert Calloway did, because he had always walked through gates without asking and no one had ever stopped him. Clara met him at the cheese room door. He told her he had a clean cash offer on the 40 acres, $300,000, more than the land had ever been worth. She could be in a comfortable house in Worcester by Christmas. She could let Nathan have a real career. She could take care of her mother. He said it the way he said everything, which was with the authority of someone who had always known what things were worth and what people needed, and who was doing whom a favor. Clara did not unlatch the screen door. She said she appreciated the offer. She said the answer was no. She said the answer was going to be no every time anyone asked in any year for the rest of her life. She said she was not leaving the 40 acres while she was alive, and she would like him to pass that along to whoever had suggested he come. And she wished him a good afternoon. He stood for a moment with the particular stillness of a man who is accustomed to being heard, and is processing the fact that he has not been. Then he said he would be back. She said he would be wrong about that. She went inside and closed the door. Within a week, every farmer in Wayne County had heard about the exchange. Some of them stopped laughing about the buffalo for the first time in 5 years. Some of them did not. But the laughter had a different quality now, the way the laughter at a poker table changes when someone turns over a hand that surprises the room. Not disbelief anymore. Something more complicated. The federal dairy buyout program came in 1986, but its shadow fell across 1984 and 1985 as clearly as if it had already happened, because farmers who understood the direction of things were already beginning to make calculations about whether staying in the Holstein business made sense. 17 Wayne County dairy operations would eventually take the buyout when it came. Several of them had already begun the conversations with their bankers in 1984. Bert Calloway refinanced for the third time in early 1985. Nathan heard about it through Edmund Grayson at the bank, not as gossip, but as a fact that Grayson mentioned quietly to Nathan one afternoon in February when Nathan came in to discuss the farm's operating note renewal. Grayson said Bert had come in the previous month and that the regional office was beginning to ask questions about collateral. Nathan drove home and told Clara. She wrote it in her tally book. She drew no conclusions around it in writing. The conclusions were self-evident and she had no interest in enjoying them. What she had interest in was February of 1985, when she sat down with the tally book and did the calculation she had been building towards since 1978. The herd was 41 head. The cheese line was 43% of total farm revenue. The Holstein line was 57%. The gap was 9 percentage points. She circled the 43, drew a line under it, and wrote in the margin the year she believed the lines would cross. She closed the book and put it in the drawer, and did not mention it to Nathan. What she did not know in February of 1985, what she would not know until Nathan came home one afternoon in March and sat down at the oak table with a particular expression on his face. The expression of someone who has been carrying something for a while and has decided the time has come to set it down, was that there had been a moment 5 years earlier when the entire operation had come within a single phone call of ending. Nathan had run into Edmund Grayson at the hardware store on a Saturday morning. They had talked for 20 minutes in the aisle between the fence post supplies and the hand tools. Grayson had asked how the farm was going, and Nathan had told him the numbers 43% and climbing, and Grayson had nodded with what Nathan described as the satisfaction of someone who has been keeping a secret for 5 years and is starting to feel the weight of it. Grayson had told Nathan that in the spring of 1980, the regional vice president of the savings bank had come to Worcester for a quarterly review and had looked at the Hensley operating note and had told Grayson to call it in. The note was $12,000, a standard short-term agricultural line of credit that the bank renewed annually. The regional vice president had looked at it and seen a 47-year-old widow with 6 water buffalo and no established market, and had decided it was not a risk the bank needed to carry. He had told Grayson to call it in, which would have meant Clara had 60 days to pay $12,000 she did not have at a moment when she had 4 milking buffalo and a cheese room that was 7 months old and a single restaurant account in Cleveland. Grayson had told the regional vice president that he was renewing the note. He had told him the operation was sound and the farmer was sound, and if the regional office wanted to press the issue, they were welcome to come to Worcester and explain to him in person why a 47-year-old widow's $12,000 operating line was the one they were going to make an example of. The regional vice president had not come to Worcester. He had not asked again. Grayson had told Nathan at the hardware store on a Saturday morning in March of 1985, 5 years after it happened, because he felt the time had come, and because he did not think Clara should go the rest of her life, not knowing that the thing that had been standing between her operation and ruin in the spring of 1980 was a bank manager who had looked at a widow's $12,000 note and decided that some things were more important than what the regional office wanted. Nathan came home and sat at the oak table and told Clara everything Grayson had said. Clara sat with it for a long time without speaking. Then she said she was driving into Worcester in the morning. She drove in the next day. She walked into the savings bank and went to Edmund Grayson's office and set a wheel of mozzarella on his desk. Grayson told her that was not necessary. She said she knew it was not necessary. She left it on the desk and walked out. Grayson took it home that evening and ate it with his wife at the kitchen table, and did not tell her where it had come from until they had eaten half of it. His wife looked at him and said it was the best thing she had ever tasted, and asked who had made it. He told her. The Wilson widow with the buffalo. He started to say, then corrected himself. The Hensley widow. He said he had told her she was going to fail in 1980. His wife looked at him across the table. She said he should be glad he had the good sense to be wrong about it quietly. He said he was. In the spring of 1986, a letter arrived at the Hensley farm with a Brooklyn return address. 3 typed paragraphs on plain letterhead from a man named Sal Mancini, who operated a specialty cheese shop called Casa Duquesne in the Carroll Gardens neighborhood. He wrote that he was looking for an American source of fresh water. Buffalo mozzarella that the Italian imports he had been relying on were suffering in shipping that a Vermont breeder named William Pratt had given him Clara's name, and that he would like to drive out and taste her cheese if she would receive him. Clara wrote back 3 sentences in pencil. She told him she would receive him on the 15th of April at 6 in the morning. She told him to come hungry. She put up the red flag on the mailbox and went back to the cheese room. Sal Mancini drove 470 miles from Brooklyn. He left at 5 in the morning and drove through New Jersey and across Pennsylvania and into Ohio as the sun came up over the eastern part of the state. He stopped twice, once for fuel and once for coffee. He pulled into the gravel yard of the Hensley farm at 6:15 in the morning. He was 54 years old. Dark gray wool coat, dark suit underneath silver hair. He carried a leather satchel. He looked like a man who understood that when you drove 470 miles to ask a widow farmer in Ohio to sell you cheese, you arrived looking like someone who could pay for it. Clara came out before he knocked. Barn coat, wool sweater, jeans, boots that had seen 1,000 mornings like this one. She told him to come in and said she had coffee. He came in. They sat at the oak table. He looked around the kitchen. The way people look at a place when they are trying to understand what kind of people lived and worked there. He looked at the framed photograph of Robert on the wall above the refrigerator. He looked at the 7-year almanac stack on the shelf by the door. He looked at the leather tally book on the counter. He told her he had tasted his grandmother's mozzarella in Naples in 1939 when he was 7 years old. He said she made it fresh every morning in a stone kitchen outside the city, and he had not tasted anything like it since. He said he had come to Clara not only because William Pratt had recommended her, but because he had been looking for that specific thing for 15 years and had begun to believe it did not exist on this side of the Atlantic. Clara told him she would like to show him the operation before he tasted anything. She said she wanted him to understand what he was buying before he decided whether he wanted it. He said that was exactly right. They spent the morning walking the farm. Nathan was already in the milking parlor when they came through, and Clara introduced them. Sal watched Nathan work the morning milking, watched the milk come down slow and thick and cream-colored, caught some in a stainless cup, and held it to the light of the open barn door, and said nothing, just held it and looked at it. Then Clara brought him down to the cheese room. He stopped when he saw the glass case on the wall. He walked to it and stood in front of it for 2 full minutes without speaking. The 7 wooden molds inside, hand-carved from Italian alder in 1879, rubbed smooth by a century of hands. When he turned around, his voice was quiet. He said his grandmother had kept molds like those in her kitchen in Naples. He said they had been destroyed in 1943, when the city was bombed and her farmhouse was burned, and everything in it was lost. He said he had not seen molds like those since he was a boy. He said, "Thank you for showing me this." He said this was why he had driven 470 miles. Upstairs at the oak table, Clara had set out a white ceramic plate with 3 fresh balls of mozzarella made the previous afternoon, a dish of olive oil, a small bowl of cracked pepper, a loaf of bread from the Mennonite bakery in Millersburg. Sal sat down and looked at the plate for a moment. Then he reached out and took one piece and put it in his mouth and chewed. He set the piece down. He took a second piece and chewed that one slowly. His eyes filled. He looked at Clara across the table for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was raw. The voice of a man who has been waiting for something for 15 years and has just found it, and is not entirely sure what to do with the feeling. He said this was his grandmother's cheese. He said he was 7 years old in Naples in 1939, and this was exactly what she made. He set his hands flat on either side of the plate. He said he would like to discuss a supply arrangement. Clara said she was listening. He opened the leather satchel and laid a typed document on the table. Clean letterhead. Casa Duquesne, Brooklyn. 4 pages. The terms were straightforward. 300 pounds per week of fresh mozzarella packed in waxed paper, shipped via overnight refrigerated freight. Base price of $22 per pound. Annual revenue at full delivery $343,000. Contract term of 5 years. Clara read it twice. She picked up the pencil from the counter and wrote 2 questions in the margin of the 3rd page. She asked about the summer months when the buffalo produced less milk. She said she could not guarantee 300 pounds every week through July and August. He asked what she could guarantee. She said 220 pounds in the summer months, 300 the rest of the year. Annual total would stay roughly the same. He said he could work with that. He said they would adjust the minimum floor for those months. She moved to the second question. She said she had been supplying Vincent Caruso in Cleveland and 3 other accounts for 7 years. She said she would not break those relationships for any contract. He did not hesitate. He asked how much they bought. She told him 18 pounds per week across 4 accounts. He said he would reserve 18 pounds in her production schedule. The contract would cover the rest. He said he was not asking her to abandon a single account she had built. He was asking only that she consult him before adding new wholesale buyers. She looked at the document one more time. Then she picked up the pencil and signed at the bottom of the 4th page. Sal signed under her name. Nathan and Ruth Ulbrecht, who had arrived for her Saturday lesson and been standing quietly in the doorway for the last 10 minutes, signed as witnesses. Sal stood and shook Clara's hand. He shook Nathan's hand. He shook Ruth's hand. He told Clara he was going to write a letter to his grandmother's grave that evening. He said he was going to tell her he had found the cheese. Clara said she would know. He put on his coat and walked out to the car and drove back to Brooklyn that same afternoon, stopping once for fuel outside Akron, once for coffee in Pennsylvania, arriving at his shop at 1 in the morning. Nathan stood at the kitchen window and watched the taillights disappear down the gravel lane. Then he came back to the table and sat down across from his mother. He told her she had done it. She told him they had done it. He looked at the signed document on the table. $343,000 a year. From 40 acres. From 6 animals that Gerald Tanner had stood at the fence and told her she would sell at salvage price to a zoo in Columbus. He said he wanted to convert the whole operation. Sell the Holsteins. Convert the 40 acres entirely to buffalo. Clara was quiet for a moment. She got up and went to the drawer beside the stove and took out the tally book. She opened it to the page where she had written the number and circled it and drawn the line and written the year in the margin. She turned the book around and set it on the table in front of him. The year she had written in the margin was 1986. Nathan looked at it. He looked at his mother. She said it looked like she had been right about the timing. Outside in the back pasture, 41 water buffalo grazed in the late afternoon light. Patient and unhurried and exactly where they were supposed to be. The same as they had been on the morning of September 5th, 1978, when the first 6 walked down a ramp into a Wayne County dawn, in a county full of people who thought they were watching a woman make the worst mistake of her life. They had been wrong then. The number on the table said, how wrong? Clara put the tally book back in the drawer. She picked up the signed contract and set it on the shelf beside the almanac stack. Then she went to start the evening milking because the animals did not care about contracts and the milk did not wait. And there was work to do, the same as there had always been. Work to do. The same as there would always be work to do. And that was not a complaint. That was the point. The federal dairy buyout program arrived in 1986, the way most government programs arrive in farm country, which is to say that the paperwork came first and the relief came later. And in between there was a season of decisions that no farmer makes easily, because the decision to take the buyout is also the decision to admit that the thing you have been doing is finished. 17 Wayne County dairy operations took it that year. Some of them had seen it coming for 2 years. Some of them signed the papers feeling relief they were surprised to feel. Some of them drove home from the county agent's office and sat at their kitchen tables and did not speak to their wives for a long time. The federal Class 1 milk price stayed at $12 per hundredweight. It did not recover that year, and it would not recover the year after. The mathematics of a mid-size Holstein operation in central Ohio in 1986 were not mathematics that worked in the farmer's favor. And the men who had been running those operations for 20 and 30 years understood mathematics well enough to know when the numbers had turned against them, for good. Bert Calloway was not a stupid man. This is important to understand because the easiest version of this story makes him a villain. And villains are often assumed to be stupid, and Bert was not. He had run 400 acres of Holston dairy in Wayne County for 20 years with the particular competence of a man who understood scale and leverage and the way institutional relationships work when you know which doors to knock on. He had been on the right side of the federal milk price for most of the 1970s. He had refinanced at what seemed like reasonable times, for what seemed like reasonable reasons. And the interest rates had not cooperated, and the milk price had not cooperated. And by the summer of 1987, the bank had stopped cooperating as well. The third refinance request was denied in August. The regional office had decided that Bert Calloway's 400 acres of Holston dairy in Wayne County, Ohio, was not a risk they were willing to extend further. They had looked at the numbers the way banks look at numbers, and they had reached the conclusion that the numbers did not support confidence, and they had communicated this to Edmund Grayson in a letter that Grayson had read 3 times before picking up the phone to call Bert. Grayson told Clara about it in September, not as gossip, but because he felt she had the right to know given everything. He said it simply and without editorializing. He said Bert's operation was going to be liquidated before the end of the year. He said the bank was going to take the land. Clara listened. She thanked him. She drove home and wrote the date in her tally book and drew no line under it. On a Tuesday morning in November of 1987, Bert Calloway drove his pickup to the Hensley farm. It was not the dark suit this time. It was work clothes worn at the knees. The kind of clothes that belong to a man who has spent 40 years doing physical labor and still dresses for the work, even when the work is no longer his to do. He parked at the gate and got out and stood there for a moment with his cap in his hand. Nathan saw him from the barn and came to the gate. He did not open it immediately. Bert said he was not there to cause trouble. He said he knew what he had done, and he was not going to pretend otherwise. He said he had heard from people in town that the Hensley operation was growing and that they might need an extra hand for the herd work, the physical labor, the fence maintenance, and the feeding and the pasture rotation. He said he knew buffalo. He had read everything he could find on them in the past 2 years because he had been watching what was happening on the 40 acres to the south of him, and he understood the animal well enough to be useful. He said he would work for standard day labor wages, and he was not asking for anything else. Nathan looked at him for a long time. Then he went to the barn and found his mother. Clara came to the gate. She looked at Bert standing with his cap in his hand. She looked at him for 30 seconds without speaking, not with contempt, not with satisfaction, with the careful attention of a woman who is assessing a situation and deciding what it requires. She said, "Monday morning, 5 o'clock. Bring boots." Then she opened the gate and went back to the cheese room. Bert Calloway worked the Hensley farm for 2 years. He came every weekday at 5 in the morning and worked until the afternoon chores were done, and he drove home and came back the next day. He was good with the animals as he had said he would be. He had a farmer's hands and a farmer's instincts, and the particular usefulness of someone who has spent 4 decades learning how land and livestock behave. He kept the fences in good repair and rotated the pasture with care and never had to be told something twice. He and Clara did not discuss what had passed between them. They did not discuss the letter he had arranged to have sent from the State Agricultural Department in 1981, or the offer he had made at the cheese room door in 1983, or any of the other pressures that had arrived at the Hensley farm. with his involvement behind them. They discussed the herd and the pasture and the fence and the work, and that was what there was to discuss, and both of them understood that this was the appropriate arrangement, and neither of them moved to change it. There was an afternoon in the second year when Bert was repairing a section of fence along the north boundary, the line between what had been his land and what was now the bank's, and eventually would be subdivided and sold to a developer from Columbus. He worked the fence line for 3 hours without stopping tightening the wire and resetting the posts, and Clara watched him from a distance for a few minutes without his knowing she was watching. She did not know exactly what she felt watching him. It was not triumph, and it was not pity. It was something more complicated than either the feeling you get when you have been in a long contest with someone, and the contest has ended, and the ending is not what either of you expected, and you are both still standing in the field. She went back to the cheese room. She had work to do. On a Saturday afternoon in October of 1988, Gerald Tanner drove to the Hensley farm and parked at the gate and walked up to the barn and found Clara in the cheese room. She was working curd at the stretching table, her hands moving through the hot water in the steady, practiced rhythm of someone who has done this 10,000 times and stopped counting. He stood in the doorway for a full minute. She knew he was there. She kept working. Then he said her name. She did not stop the stretch, but she looked up. He said he had been thinking about Robert. He said he had been thinking about what he should have said to her in September of 1978 when she stood at that gate with her tally book, and he listed 6 reasons she was gonna fail. He said he knew now what he should have said then. He said he had not known in April of 1979 when she sold the first wheel in Cleveland, and he had not known in 1980 when he drove out in the middle of the night and helped her save an animal, and drove home without saying what he was thinking. He said he had not known because he was the kind of man he was, and being that kind of man had taken him a long time to see clearly. He said he was not asking forgiveness. He said he was asking whether he could come stand at her gate one Saturday a season and learn what he should have learned 10 years ago. Clara stopped the stretch. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked to the door and stood looking at him. She did not unlatch the screen. She told him he had been forgiven on the night he drove out to the pasture at 3 in the morning to save an animal that was not his. She said he had been forgiven before he made the drive, because she had called him, and he had come. And a man who comes at 3 in the morning when you need him has already answered the question. He said he had needed to come today anyway. She told him to come in and said she would pour coffee. She unlatched the door. He came in. She poured from the pot she kept in the cheese room for the long stretching sessions. They sat at the small table Nathan had built for quality checks, the one with 2 chairs and a view of the aging room through the interior window. Gerald looked at the glass case on the wall. He asked her to tell him about the molds. So she did. She told him about Rosa DeLuca, 18 years old, crossing the Atlantic in 1898, in steerage with a chestnut box containing the tools of a craft that had been practiced in her family for 4 generations. She told him about Tommaso Rosa's grandfather carving the molds from a block of Italian alder in 1879, cutting each one by hand in the autumn evenings after the farm work was done, rubbing them smooth over years of use until they held the warmth of the hands that had shaped them. She told him about the recipe book, the sealed cultures in their beeswax paper, the letter Rosa wrote in April of 1961, the year before she died, the $400 in the small envelope saved bill by bill over 30 years for a granddaughter she believed would know what to do with them. She told him about driving to Vermont alone in August of 1978 without telling Nathan. She told him about William Pratt's pasture in the late afternoon light. and the 6 animals she had chosen, and the $4,800 she had counted onto a kitchen table in Bristol. She told him about Nathan standing in the gravel yard at 5:30 in the morning, watching the first animals come down the ramp and starting to laugh. She told him about Jacob Schlabach building the cheese room, because his father had eaten a sandwich in 1924 and talked about it until he died. She told him about Helen coming to the milking parlor that October and asking to be the first buyer in the county. Gerald's head came up at that. He said Helen had come to the barn. Clara said she had. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said Helen had never told him that. Clara said she knew. He sat with his coffee and looked at the molds in the case and did not speak for a while. Then he said he owed her the whole county. He said he did not know how to begin to make that right. Clara told him he had made it right in a dark pasture in the middle of a March night in 1980, when he had not asked a single question and had just done what needed doing. She said, "Some debts get paid in ways that don't look like payment at the time." He nodded slowly. He finished his coffee. He stood and thanked her and drove home. That evening he found Helen in the kitchen and told her where he had been. She looked at him from across the room with an expression he recognized as the one she used when she had been waiting for something, and was relieved to see it finally arrive. He told her he knew about the cheese. She said she supposed he did. He asked how long. She said since the spring of 1979. She said she had bought a pound every week or so when she could get to the farm without him knowing. She said she had kept it in the bottom of the refrigerator behind the leftover ham. She said she had spent more than $1,000 of the household money over 9 years on Clara Hensley's mozzarella, and she was not sorry about a single cent of it. Gerald sat down at the kitchen table with his cap in his hands. He said he had eaten her grocery store mozzarella for 9 years, while the real thing was sitting behind the ham in his own refrigerator. Helen said that was about right. He looked up at her. He said he owed her an apology, too. She told him what she had told him many times over the years in many different forms, which was that she knew who he was, and she had chosen him anyway, and she did not need the apology. But she did need him to go back to Clara Hensley's farm on Saturdays and learn whatever Clara was willing to teach him. Because a man who has been wrong about something important has a responsibility to understand why, and understanding why takes time and attention. And sitting in someone else's kitchen without talking too much. He went back on the following Saturday, and the Saturday after that, for the next several years until his health made the drives difficult. Gerald Tanner came to the Hensley farm on Saturday mornings and sat in the cheese room or walked the pasture or helped with fence work. And Clara taught him what she knew, not just about the cheese but about the whole philosophy of the thing. The independence, the craft, the chain of knowledge passed hand to hand. The difference between building something that endures and building something that depends on conditions staying favorable. He was a good student. He had always been intelligent. He simply needed to be in a position where his intelligence was not defending a conclusion he had already reached. Ruth Albrecht had her own operation in Holmes County by 1992. 12 Buffalo, a small cheese room she had built with her husband's help. The same way Jacob Schlabach had built Clara's, starting from what she needed and working outward. She had taught 2 women by 1995. Those 2 women were teaching others by 1998. The chain was moving the way Clara had designed it, to move one person at a time, each one carrying the same condition forward, each one extending the line by one link. Clara did not count the links often. She tracked them in the tally book because tracking things was what the tally book was for. But she did not make much of the numbers in conversation. The numbers were not the point. The point was that the knowledge was alive and moving. In the spring of 2001, a letter arrived from the American Cheese Society. Clara read it at the kitchen table. The board had voted to permanently display the 7 wooden molds from the chestnut box in their headquarters lobby in Denver, in a glass-fronted oak cabinet, as a permanent exhibition, and they were asking whether she would come to the dedication ceremony in July. She put the letter on the table and looked at it for a while. Nathan was in the doorway. He had seen the letterhead and was waiting. She said she supposed she would go. He said he would go with her. She said she had never been on an airplane. He said he knew. He said that was going to change in July. They flew to Denver on a Thursday. Nathan and his wife Sarah and their daughter Grace, who was 12 years old that summer, and had spent enough Saturday mornings in the cheese room to know how to stretch curd properly, and to understand that the wooden molds in the glass case were the reason for all of it. Clara sat by the window and watched Ohio become small and flat, and then become something else entirely, the land changing its shape and color as they moved west. And she thought about Rosa on the ship in 1898, the Atlantic crossing in steerage, nothing familiar in any direction, nothing to look at but water and the chestnut box in her hands. The ceremony was on a Friday afternoon. The lobby of the American Cheese Society headquarters held 240 people, cheesemakers and distributors and food writers and agricultural scholars, and a few farmers who had driven or flown long distances to be there. The glass-fronted oak cabinet stood against the far wall with a small velvet cord in front of it. And inside the cabinet, the 7 molds carved in 1879 sat on a white cloth and looked exactly as they had always looked, small and simple and worn smooth by more than a century of purpose. Clara walked to the podium. She was 71 years old. Her hair was white. Her hands were the hands of someone who had worked with them every day for 50 years, strong and marked and without apology. She set those hands on either side of the podium and looked out at the room. She said her name. She said she was from a 40-acre farm in Wayne County, Ohio. She said that her grandmother carried those molds across the Atlantic from Italy in the spring of 1898. She was 18 years old. She did not know if she would see her mother again. She had not met the man she would marry. She had not had the daughter who would have the daughter who would stand at this podium. She paused. She said her grandmother was on that morning in 1898, only a young woman carrying her grandmother's tools to a country she had never seen. She paused again and let that sit in the room. She said she was not going to give a longer speech than that. She said the only thing she wanted to leave them with was this: find one promise in your family. One. And keep it even if it takes 50 years. She stepped back from the podium. The room was silent for a full minute. The kind of silence that is not absence but presence. The kind that happens when a room of people is holding something together without knowing they are doing it. Then it broke and the room stood and the applause went on for 4 minutes. Clara stood beside the podium with her hands at her sides. She did not weep. She had been past weeping for the big things for a long time. The weeping happened at odd moments now, at small things, at the sound of the milk coming down in the early morning, or the smell of curd warming in the vat, or the way Grace held her hands over the hot water when she was learning the stretch, slightly too cautious. The way every beginner is slightly too cautious before they understand that the heat is part of it. Nathan and Sarah came up and put their arms around her. Grace took her grandmother's hand, and they walked together to the cabinet. The 4 of them, and Clara looked at the molds through the glass. She put her fingertips against the case. She did not say anything. She did not need to. And then a hand touched her arm. Clara turned. Behind her stood a woman she had never seen before. 80 years old, maybe more, small and careful in her movements, wearing a dark dress and a wool cardigan that had seen many winters. Her hair was white and pinned simply. She had the face of someone who has lived with intention, the lines of it organized by thought rather than by accident. She introduced herself in a voice that was thin but steady. Her name was Frances Moretti. She was from Pittsburgh. She had driven from Pittsburgh that morning 7 hours because she had read about the ceremony in a Food Society newsletter. And she had known for a long time that someday there would be such a ceremony, and that when it happened, she would need to be there. Clara waited. Frances Moretti opened the small bag she was carrying and took out an envelope, old and carefully preserved, the kind of envelope that has been kept in a drawer and handled rarely because the person keeping it understood that some things need to be kept with intention. Inside the envelope was a photograph, black and white, printed on the kind of paper they used in the 1920s, slightly curled at the edges from age. Frances held it out to Clara. Clara took it. She looked at it. Two women standing in front of a clapboard house, a house Clara recognized as the house her grandmother had lived in from 1910 until 1962. The house that had been sold after Rosa's death and was now someone else's entirely. The women were standing close together, in the way of people who know each other well. One of them Clara had seen only in photographs, young and dark-haired, wearing an apron, and looking directly at the camera with the particular directness of someone who has nothing to hide and no reason to pretend. The other woman Clara did not recognize. On the back of the photograph, in handwriting that was not Rosa's, a date, June 1923, and two names, Rosa, Constance. Clara looked up. Frances said that the woman named Constance was her grandmother. She said Constance Moretti had come to America from the same region of Italy as Rosa DeLuca 5 years later, in 1903, and had settled in Pittsburgh where her husband's brother had work. She said Constance and Rosa had found each other the way Italian women found each other. In those years, through church, and through the particular longing of people who have left a country they loved and are trying to understand the country they have chosen. She said they had been friends for 40 years, from 1910 until Rosa moved away from the neighborhood in the 1950s. She said her grandmother had spoken of Rosa DeLuca more than almost anyone else in her life had spoken of her, with the specific affection reserved for people who have seen you clearly and liked what they saw. Clara's throat went tight. Frances reached back into the envelope and took out a folded piece of paper. She unfolded it carefully and held it out. It was a letter handwritten in Italian dated 1959. 3 years before Rosa died. Clara could not read all of it. The Italian was old and her grandmother's dialect was difficult, but she could read enough. Rosa had written to Constance about a granddaughter, about a girl in Wayne County named Clara, who had married a farmer named Robert and was running 40 acres of dairy with the particular quiet competence that Rosa said was in their blood. She had written that she was going to leave the girl the box. She had written that she believed the girl would know what the box meant when the time came, even if it took her a while to be ready. And then there was a line near the end of the letter that Clara read twice to make sure she had it right. Rosa had written that she had told Constance about the promise years ago, and that Constance would understand it, and that when the day came when the cheese was real again and the promise was kept, she hoped Constance or Constance's people would be there to see it. Rosa had known she would not be there herself. She had been 79 years old when she wrote the letter. She had known her time was close, so she had written to her oldest friend, and she had asked her friend's family to carry the knowledge forward and to be present someday when the thing she had believed in arrived. Frances said her grandmother had kept that letter in a drawer for the rest of her life and had made Frances promise to keep it after Constance was gone. She said Constance had died in 1971, and Frances had kept the letter for 30 years and had been watching and waiting without knowing exactly what she was waiting for. Then she had read about the American Cheese Society ceremony and the molds from Wayne County, Ohio, and she had understood that this was what Constance had told her to wait for. She said she wanted Clara to have both the letter and the photograph. She said they belonged with the molds and with the family that had carried the promise forward. Clara held the photograph and the letter for a long time. The lobby had gone quiet around them, people giving the two women space without knowing quite what they were witnessing. She looked at Frances Moretti from Pittsburgh, 80 years old, who had driven 7 hours to deliver a photograph taken in 1923 in front of a house in Wayne County because a woman named Constance had made a promise to a woman named Rosa and had kept it for 40 years and then handed it to the next generation to keep. Clara said it was a long way to drive. Frances said it had been a long time to wait. She said the distance was not the hard part. Clara put her arm around this woman she had never met and would not meet again, and they stood together for a moment in front of the glass case with Rosa's molds inside it. Two women from different families who had been connected for 60 years by a friendship that had ended before either of them was old enough to know it existed. Then Frances said she needed to start the drive back to Pittsburgh before it got too late, and they said goodbye, and she went. Nathan had been standing close enough to hear most of it. He did not say anything for a while. Then he said he thought Rosa had planned it all along. He said he thought she had known from the beginning that the promise would need witnesses from outside the family, people who carried it differently, and that she had arranged for that without telling anyone, because Rosa was apparently the kind of woman who arranged things and then let them arrive in their own time. Clara said that sounded right. Grace was holding her grandmother's hand and had been quiet through the whole of the exchange with Frances Moretti, listening with the particular attention of a 12-year-old who understands she is in the presence of something important, even if she cannot yet name everything it means. She asked her grandmother whether Rosa had known it would all work out. Clara looked at her granddaughter. She thought about the $400 saved bill by bill for 30 years. She thought about the letter to Constance in 1959. She thought about the instruction to buy the buffalo and trust the hands. She said Rosa had not known for certain. Nobody knows for certain, but she had believed clearly enough and prepared carefully enough and communicated broadly enough that she had given the thing every possible chance to become real. She said that was not the same as knowing, but it was close enough to count. They flew home the next morning. Clara sat by the window again and watched the land come back, the flat particular green and brown of Ohio from the air, the grid of county roads and farm fields, and the small configurations of barns and silos that meant someone lived there and was working and had been working for a long time and intended to keep working. She ran the operation until 2005. She was 75 years old that spring, and her hands were slower than they had been, and her mornings started earlier because sleep came less easily, and she found she did not mind the extra dark hours before the milking, sitting at the oak table with the almanac and the tally book and the coffee. But she understood that the cheese room needed younger hands, and that Nathan was 50 years old and had been ready to take it for years, and had been waiting for her to say so. She said so in March of 2005. She sat across from him at the oak table and said she was handing him the keys to the cheese room, and that she would still do the morning milking as long as she was able, and that she expected to be consulted on decisions of significance, but that the daily operation was his. She said his grandmother Rosa had passed the recipe book to a granddaughter, and she was doing the same, that the forms were different, but the principle was identical. Nathan said he had been waiting for her to say that for 3 years. She said she knew. She said she had made him wait because she needed to be sure he was ready, not just technically, but in the way that matters, which is the way you think about a thing. When you are alone with it in the early morning and nobody is watching. He said he had been thinking about it that way for a long time. She told him she knew that too. She said that was why she was handing him the keys today instead of next year. Ruth Albrecht came twice a week after that, driving over from Holmes County, helping with the morning milking when Clara's hands were slow, sitting in the cheese room during the long stretching sessions, keeping her company the way you keep company with someone who taught you something that mattered. They did not always talk. They had been working alongside each other long enough that the silence was comfortable. The particular comfortable silence of two people who have made the same thing many times together and do not need to explain it to each other anymore. Clara died in the early fall of 2014. She was 84 years old. She died in the house that had belonged to Robert's grandfather, in the bed she had shared with Robert for 26 years with Nathan in the room. She was buried in the Worcester Lutheran Cemetery beside Robert. The stone reads her name and the years she lived and one line at the bottom. She kept the promise. No explanation. No elaboration. Anyone who needed to know what promise would have to learn the story. And learning the story was the point. The farm continued. Nathan ran the cheese room with the same discipline and care his mother had built into it. The same twice daily milking. The same 92 degrees for the culture. The same hot water for the stretch. The same molds set on the same tables. Jacob Schlabach had built in 1981. The Casa Duquesne contract, renewed every 5 years since 1986, was renewed again. The accounts in Cleveland that Vincent Caruso had started continued through his son, who had taken over the restaurant in 1998 and understood exactly what he had inherited. Ruth Albrecht's chain had extended to 9 women by the time Clara died. 2 of them had operations in neighboring counties. 3 more had spread further east into the state. The others were scattered, one in western Pennsylvania, one in upstate New York, one in Vermont where William Pratt had once kept his herd on land that was now someone else's, though the knowledge Pratt had carried was still alive in different hands. Gerald Tanner died in 2006. His obituary in the Worcester Daily Record mentioned his 21 years as county agricultural extension agent and listed several local organizations he had served, and at the end added that he had been a long-standing friend of the Hensley family. It was a short line. It covered a lot of ground. Helen Tanner outlived him by 6 years. She came to the farm a few times after Gerald was gone, sitting with Clara at the oak table in the way they had been sitting at tables together since they were girls. And in 2008, when Clara was 78, Helen told her that she had not regretted a single pound of cheese she had bought over the years, not the first pound in April of 1979, or any of the hundreds of pounds in the years after. She said the cheese had been the best part of her Sundays for 30 years, and she was grateful for every one of them. Clara told her the first pound had always meant the most. Helen said she supposed that was true of most things. Edmund Grayson retired in 1992 and moved to a smaller house in Worcester and lived quietly until his death in 2003. He had a photograph on the wall of his study that his wife had taken a photograph of the cheese room in the Hensley basement from a visit he had made in 1988. The white walls and the stainless vats and the wooden stretching tables and the glass case with the molds on the wall above. He had asked for and received permission to take one photograph, and he had kept it on the wall for 15 years because he said it reminded him of the most important decision he had made in 30 years of banking, which was to pick up a phone in the spring of 1980 and tell a regional vice president that some things are not about the numbers. The 7 wooden molds are still in Denver. In the lobby of the American Cheese Society headquarters in the glass-fronted oak cabinet where they were placed in July of 2001. Beside them now is a framed photograph, a copy of the one Francis Moretti drove 7 hours to deliver. Two women standing in front of a clapboard house in Wayne County, Ohio in June of 1923. Rosa, Constance. The names written on the back in handwriting that has been photographed and preserved, so it does not have to be handled anymore. If you go to Denver and stand in front of that cabinet and look at the photograph, and look at the molds beside it, you are looking at the distance between 1879 and today, and the distance between Italy and Ohio, and the distance between a promise made on a ship crossing the Atlantic and the promise kept on a farm in Wayne County by a woman who opened a box she was not quite ready to open on a December night because her mother had a clear moment and used it to ask the right question. The thing about a promise like that is that it does not require you to be extraordinary. It requires you to be consistent. It requires you to keep doing the work on the mornings when no one is watching, and the numbers have not yet proven you right. And the people whose opinion you respect are telling you quietly and not unkindly that you are probably wrong. It requires you to stay at the table and stretch the curd and heat the water to 92 degrees and trust that the thing you learned from someone who learned it in a stone farmhouse in Italy before anyone thought to write it down, is worth the trust you are placing in it. Clara Hensley did not think of herself as a remarkable woman. She thought of herself as a woman who had been given a clear set of instructions by someone who loved her and had prepared carefully and believed completely. And she had followed those instructions because not following them would have required her to decide that Rosa was wrong, and she had never been able to make herself believe that. The farm is still there. The cheese room is still in the basement. The tally books are in the drawer beside the stove, the later ones in Nathan's handwriting now, the earlier ones in Clara's small, precise hand, the numbers running back 40 years. On some Saturday mornings, if you were there, you would see the same thing. You might have seen in 1981 or 1985 or 1992 or any year in between, a woman working at the stretching table in the low light of the cheese room, her hands moving through hot water, pulling the curd, folding it, pulling again, the motion steady and unhurried, the motion that contains inside it every generation of women who did it before her, and every generation that will do it after. And on the wall above the table in the glass case Nathan built to replace the one Clara made in 1978, the 7 wooden molds carved in 1879 sit on white cloth, in the way they have always sat, small and simple and worn smooth by more than a century of hands that knew what they were for. Not used for cheese, used for memory, used for the reason you do the work even when the work is hard, and the county is laughing and the bank is asking questions you do not have comfortable answers to. Used for the reminder that the most important things a careful person does are almost always invisible to the room until the moment they are not. And by then, the only thing left to do is stand quietly and let the silence speak for itself. Because some things have been proven already, and the proving happens slowly over years in the dark before the morning milking, when nobody was watching and the promise was just a promise, and the work was just the work. And one woman had decided that was enough.